I like Mega Man. Mega Man is one of those franchises that I just can't get enough of. Be it Classic, X, ZX, Legends. I haven't played much of the Battle Network games since I was really little, but as a fan of the franchise and as a fan of RPGs, I'm sure I'll find something to like about it. But for me, it all starts with Zero. 2. Mega Man Zero 2 was one of the first games I ever owned and was pretty integral to my development, to the point where I see bits of Zero in a lot of the things I enjoy as an adult. While I consider myself to be a big fan of the Mega Man Zero games, I only ever had 2 and 3 growing up, and only got to experience 1 and 4 through videos on YouTube. So when I heard the Zero Collection was coming to Steam with the original 4 games along with ZX and its sequel, 2 other very important games to me, I was amped to replay some of my favorite childhood games, as well as finally playing the ones I never got around to. So let's talk about Mega Man Zero. The Mega Man X games before it had remarkably fluid controls. While Zero isn't developed by the same team, it does feel like an extension of the movement system from the X games. Dashing, wall jumping, dash jumping, all just feel so smooth and make controlling Zero a joy. And the little after image whenever you dash just adds to the grace and elegance that comes with just moving around. All I can say criticism-wise is that not a lot has changed on the movement end, which is a shame considering how much of a paradigm shift dashing and wall jumping were to the Mega Man series, that Zero doesn't try to do that again by shaking up the movement system. The biggest gameplay change is the 2-weapon system. What this means is, beyond having access to 2 weapons at a time, you can now charge 1 weapon while still having the other free to attack, which was impossible in previous games. This greatly increases the player's options in a fight. Zero has his iconic Z-Saber with its core moveset from the X series, but he can also attack while running and dashing from the start, which gives the stages and combat a forward sense of momentum, allowing the players to dash and slash their way through stages. Zero can also now charge his Z-Saber for a devastating crash attack that just melts bosses' health bars. Unfortunately, he doesn't gain any techniques like he does in the X series, but if you level up enough, you do unlock the Rolling Slash, which can be performed in the air and on the ground. Zero also picks up a blaster from a dead soldier that functions like your typical Mega Buster with 3 levels of charge, the third being the most powerful. He also has a shield boomerang, which blocks weak shots and can turn into a giant energy shuriken when thrown. He also gets the triple spear, which I didn't really use. You can attack in 8 directions, but you can't use it while moving, so I found it pretty useless. I know higher level players can do crazy stuff with this, but I'm just not one of those. I never really felt the need to use anything other than the Z-Saber and the Mega Buster, which isn't a great sign, but I did find those weapons pretty fun to use throughout. I especially like the way enemies split in half when you kill them with the Z-Saber. Bosses too. All of these can be augmented with one of the 3 elemental chips, which form a rock-paper-scissors system that, frankly, never made much sense to me. Fire beating ice is okay. Ice beating lightning, I guess if you think of ice and water being the same thing, I guess it makes sense. But why the hell would fire be weak to electricity? Hell, they're all robots, shouldn't they all be weak to electricity? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Pokemon makes this stuff look easy. It may not make sense, but it's pretty consistent and totally optional. The Mega Man series has always been really good at letting the player decide their own level of difficulty. Passwords, E-tanks, enemy weaknesses, special items are all there to help struggling players reach the end. But if you want, you can beat the entire game with just the Mega Buster and your raw platforming skills. I'd consider dynamic difficulty to be one of the series' major strengths, and Cyber Elves are an extension of this, cuddly little critters who you collect as the game goes on. They fall into 3 categories: nurses who restore your health, animals who help you in some physical way like shooting enemies or pulling you out of bottomless pits, and hackers who tweak the game's rule set, like turning enemies into mets. Some start as babies and need to be fed energy crystals so they can mature. The problem is these guys are hungry and take a ton to level up, and the game is pretty stingy with E-crystals. I was trying to get a sub-tank for this playthrough, but I never got enough E-crystals to evolve my nurse. Thankfully, there are plenty of Cyber Elves you can use without any cost. If you're struggling, then these guys got your back. The only downside is activating their ability kills them, which feels kind of cruel, but also kind of works with the melancholic blend of hopefulness and despair that the series is going for. A world where characters this pure and innocent have to face their mortality. It's understandable if you don't really care and just want your damn sub-tank, but I do think it's a pretty bold decision to have such a heavy cost for something that other games would just give you so easily. And if you really hate having to kill cyber elves, I got through the entire series never having to use them. I do really like their inclusion though. They're a great example of dynamic difficulty, and their designs are pretty iconic to the series. If you play through this series, then I guarantee you'll want a keychain or a plush of at least one of these little dudes. On the topic of difficulty, let's talk about an aspect of the game's challenge that isn't so great. Mega Man Zero's continue system is pretty esoteric. It's basically lives, but with more steps. When you die, you get a game over, no matter what. Your options are to retry, which depletes from a limited resource that we're going to call lives. To reload your last save is pretty self-explanatory, and give up marks the mission as a failure and has the plot continue despite it. So if you think give up might take you back to the menu, it'll actually just progress the story. After about an hour of confused upward failure, I found myself witnessing late game reveals and being loaded into the last area on my first play session. Retries are functionally identical to lives, and the only way to get them back after dying is by reloading your save, which means you'll have to sit through reloading your save every time you die, because you don't get retries back after completing a mission, so using them all just means you won't have them the next time you need them. Here's the thing. Just use a live system, or don't. I'm honestly not that attached to them. Thankfully, the levels aren't super long, so doing them in one take isn't a super tall order, and it makes for a unique kind of challenge. So once I got that down, I was able to play the video game. But the fact that it's so poorly communicated what these options do made my first play session kind of a nightmare. The level design does that Devil May Cry thing where it has interconnected levels, but a linear structure for each mission that just teleports you where you need to go, which defeats the point of having an interconnected world. You can explore these areas on your own between missions and maybe find some hidden cyber elves. This style of level design would not persist for the rest of the Zero series and would be done much better in the ZX games, but still not perfectly. So it means you end up replaying a lot of the same levels, but I can't say you do it long enough for it to get tedious because the game is just so short. Like I said, levels are really short, which makes sense for a handheld, but the design of the levels itself isn't super remarkable. I really like this segment in the factory over this bottomless pit, especially when you have to revisit it to detonate bombs on a time limit. It was super tense. But not a lot of other levels stick out. These sand dunes gave me a hard time because they're probably the one time I was supposed to be using the triple rod. This big ship is a pretty unique justification for a crushing hazard. Question. How do you make the most frustrating mechanic in Mega Man history even more frustrating? What if it shot you with a gun? That's right. The disappearing tiles make their first and only appearance in the Zero series in this level. Wow, I got the hang of them over time. If I never see these damn blocks in another game, I really wouldn't miss them. Speaking of references to classic Mega Man, they brought back the little moving platforms from Wily 5. I normally hate moving platforms in games, but being surrounded by instant death spikes makes it difficult to get bored. I'd probably give the level design overall like a C-. It's not terribly frustrating, but little sticks out in my mind. I think the problem with Zero's gameplay is that the difficulty curve is inverted. Some of the hardest fights are at the start of the game, and not because of difficulty in the design, it's because at the start you have less tools for dealing damage. Zero has the worst kind of RPG elements. You don't so much as unlock new tools and abilities as you unlock basic functions you'd expect to have at the start, like a fully charged Buster Shot. Even X didn't have to unlock that. Zero never had to unlock his 3-hit combo in previous games either. By the time you get your weapons leveled up, you probably already have the elemental chips, which, congratulations, you now have the weakness for every boss in the game. Once you have the charged Z-Saber plus a boss's weakness, the fight becomes way too easy, which I definitely appreciated during the endgame boss gauntlet, but it made the last half of the game a total breeze. Which isn't to knock the boss design themselves. I think a lot of the fights are pretty enjoyable. I especially enjoyed Anubis and Phantom. Anubis, much like the best classic Mega Man boss, tests the player's combat and platforming abilities. Phantom is just a really fast-paced fight, and keeping up with him feels really skillful. Harpuya's attacks are fun to dodge, but every time he takes damage he does this triple slash move, and at the end he's vulnerable to getting hit. So it's really easy to loop him without even trying. I thought this E-Honda elephant was a pain, but then I realized you can sneak a shot in and hit him in his head, and that'll make him stop. RPG mechanics or no, Lightning Falcaroid is one of the tougher bosses in the game, and he's the first real boss. Then the boss right after him can instant kill you and has 3 times the health as the previous fight, which makes the start of this game so much harder than it needed to be. Overall, the boss roster is pretty solid. I can do without Rainbow Devil, Monkano, and these Wily Stage looking guys, but I think the roster overall is pretty solid. Bosses also seem to unlock new attacks the higher your rank is, but I can't show you footage of that because I never got higher than a B, just like in real life. A lot of the bosses in this game share a common problem, and what is that problem? It's screen real estate. The Game Boy Advance had a pretty limited display space, a problem that previous Mega Man games didn't have to worry about, at least during boss fights. Bosses wouldn't really be able to get off screen. Just look at this fight with Front's Walnuts from Mega Man X4. He can get off screen, but he's so big that you can always see part of him, so he can never really get the drop on you. The devs of Zero had 2 choices. Try to make the bosses interesting with the space they have, or use negative space to force the players to guess where the boss is and what they're doing. So, instead of making the right decision, a handful of bosses are able to get off screen and the player has to chase them. The problem with this is that with no real visibility, you can be walking off screen right into an enemy's attack. You can't really get a sense of where they're going because you can't see them, so they can just jump right on top of you. Bosses can hit you from off screen, but you can't hit them. If the developers were so adamant about bosses that use larger spaces like this, I would have liked to see a kind of fighting game camera implemented where the camera keeps both characters' location in mind. The AI would have to register when it's in the corner and how to react to the player's positioning, but I'm sure that's doable. Even if that sounds too complicated, I think the better decision would have been to just use the space allotted to craft as many interesting bosses as possible, without trying to use space you don't have. Some really cool bosses had to suffer because of this decision. One of Zero's biggest problems is its music. It's nowhere near as good as the music found in the Classic series, the X series, or even the ZX series. To be fair, the bubbly optimism of the Classic and ZX games might have lent better to some energetic, catchy tunes. While the X series took itself much more seriously, it was still very silly, and the music reflected that. The Zero series is the first game to really go for this moody, apocalyptic melancholy, so maybe that led to less of a focus on melody and more of a focus on atmosphere. If the goal was to set the mood, then I'd say it didn't succeed. I don't know what I'm supposed to be feeling listening to this. There's only one boss theme for the majority of the game, and I'll admit it's a little funky, but it's super repetitive and doesn't really make me want to fight. The Guardians don't get a unique theme, even Copy X doesn't have a unique theme. I think for this fight it would have been a great idea to use the fantastic X vs. Zero track from Mega Man X5. You could even mess with some of the notes so the song sounds slightly off to give the impression that something's not quite right about the fight. The first level actually reuses Zero's theme from Mega Man X1, which blew my mind when I realized it, so why not this song? The only unique boss theme is X's evil angel form, which just sounds like a crappy version of Ridley's theme. I really think the quality of the music in this game is inexcusable. I do need to give credit where credit is due and acknowledge the incredibly sinister sounding song that plays before bosses and when you get a game over. The soundtrack isn't embarrassingly bad, but it's nowhere near the high quality that the series has set for itself. I don't care much for X5 or 6, but even those games had bangers to spare. Zero's best storytelling happens in its first moments. We immediately know who the bad guys are and who the good guys are, and that the good guys are losing. As the only character with a unique design, we can assume that this young woman, named Ciel, is the leader. While backed into a corner, Ciel discovers the tomb that's rumored to contain Zero, a legendary hero from centuries past. After seeing her allies slaughtered and sacrificing her cyber elf, she's able to awaken Zero and pleads with him to help her. And just like that, we take control. Ciel is quickly kidnapped by a golem, and nothing we do seems to stop it. Right when all seems lost, a mysterious blue presence appears and gives Zero the Z-Saber, a weapon so powerful that it kills the golem in one hit. Already we have a sense of the resistance, their leaders, as well as their oppressors. We also have a mystery in the identity of the blue orb. The intro also establishes that cyber elves die when their abilities are used. Overall, it's a great introduction that's as brief as it is effective. The quality of the storytelling really starts to go downhill right away. CL tells us that Zero is a legendary hero who saved the world along with X 100 years ago, but now X is leading a crusade against Reploids deemed Maverick to kill them so they can ration the total energy being used to sustain life in the human paradise of Neo Arcadia. If you don't know what Reploids are, it's just like in-universe terminology for a human-like robot. CL is researching an energy solution to end the war as the Resistance fights a losing battle, but Zero could very well be the winning gambit they need to turn the tables. And Zero just kind of agrees to help the Resistance with nothing to gain for himself. Rather than just being nice or noble, as an amnesiac, I think Zero's priority should be to find out more about who he was. Like, not that you shouldn't help people who are getting genocided, but how does Zero know that CL isn't trying to manipulate him? I just feel like he says yes a little too quickly. What if there was a scene in the Resistance camp where Zero and CL walked through an area filled with refugees whose homes were destroyed by Neo Arcadia to let us see the consequences of the war we're fighting? Zero can be sympathetic to the Resistance, but his primary concern should be finding out who he was and seeing the other side of the conflict, both of which can be answered by X. What if Zero says to CL, I'll help your Resistance, but you need to help me find X, as X is the only person who Zero has a connection with and can tell him about who he was and can inform him what the motivation is of the other side of the conflict. Him locking in to help the Resistance needed to be more of a moment, because on my first playthrough I genuinely missed it. Here it is, by the way, the moment Zero signs on to the Resistance for the next 4 games. It doesn't feel impactful, and Zero seems completely incurious and trusts CL right away. I guess carrying out guerrilla attacks on a military superpower counts as a favor? Mega Man Zero is a great example of why showing is so important in storytelling, because the majority of what happens in the world is told to you. 90% of the relevant story sequences take place in this room between CL and Zero. We don't get a sense of who the villains are outside of the brief glimpses we get of them before boss fights, and the soldiers you save in each mission can be found in the base after they're rescued, but they don't really have any personality or impact on the story. We never really get a sense of the people we're trying to protect. We also never really get a sense of what CL's solution for the energy crisis is, what she needs to do to finish it, and what we as the player can do to help. It doesn't ruin the plot, it's just a storytelling device, but as my screenwriting professor once said, specific is terrific. Mega Man Zero's biggest contribution to the larger Mega Man canon, no pun intended, is the 4 Guardians, who are X's kids. Technically, in the lore, they're like made out of his rib or something, but screw that, they're his kids. Zero meeting these guys and discovering who they are could have been really interesting, but they just kind of show up like standard bosses with little fanfare and aren't really set up, other than previous bosses telling us that they're really cool and powerful. They all have distinct personalities. Harpooya is pompous and prideful, Fafnir is wily and energetic, Leviathan is playful and sassy, and Phantom is a ninja. I think it's a shame that we never get to see the Guardians interact with each other. For all intents and purposes, they are siblings, and it'd be really fun to see their dynamic and learn what they think of each other. The art book says that Harpooya and Fafnir like to get into fights a lot, which makes sense given their personalities, but we never see any of that. The closest we get is when Leviathan calls Fafnir and Harpooya a combat nerd and a pretty kid, respectively. She doesn't say anything about Phantom because I guess she knew he was going to die, but none of them really have a meaningful payoff. They come back and try and fight you right before X just dismisses them. During the boss gauntlet at the end, Phantom blows himself up in an attempt to kill Zero, and his siblings and surrogate father just don't even react to it. Hell, Zero doesn't even react to it. Well, like, he dodges out of the way, but, like, no one acknowledges it. If he just showed up with the Guardians in the next scene, I feel like no one would think about it twice. Also, I think this is the only time something plot significant has happened in the endgame boss gauntlet. If it sounds like the Guardians get kind of done dirty in this game, trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. As of this game, there are great pieces of concept art, but not much else. Zero also isn't super well characterized in this game. He does seem a lot more serious than his more cocky and reckless portrait in the X series, but that might just be because his portrait only has one expression. He doesn't even banter with the bosses. The only one he actually talks to is the one boss that can't talk back, which is a shame because pre-boss dialogue is basically just free characterization. One aspect I think could have been expanded on is this sort of imposter syndrome that Zero expresses, when he says, "What if I'm not the person you think I am?" Giving Zero this insecurity about his identity would have been a really humanizing trait that would have made him more relatable. He's got this legend status thrust onto him with no recollection of what he did to earn it. And this could have made him a foil to Copy X. What if Zero was his original self but wasn't sure, while Copy X could have been confident that he was the original despite being a fake? He also doesn't really want anything. He doesn't have a goal. He's not even planning to fight X until like the third act. He doesn't have a goal of his own and is just fighting alongside the Resistance because they found him first. I just think it's a shame. I still think Zero is cool, but I can't say that he's a really complex or interesting character. CL doesn't really come across much better. She does seem pretty tender and compassionate, but she also spits a lot of saccharine platitudes that sound patronizing. She also apologizes way too much. I get the impression the developers want CL to be the emotional core of the Zero series, but she doesn't have a meaningful function in the game other than saving your data, and there's no major way of interacting with her. I mean, if you get like an A rank, you can enter her room, but whatever. She just comes across as a little too precious and would have benefited from being a little less meek and having a little more personality. I just feel like there was a lot of potential here for a great story that doesn't really get utilized. There are game-changing plot twists that would put the story in a new context, but the plot twists kind of are all the story we get. The X who's in power is actually a copy of the original, and CL is the one who created that copy, when she was 10 years old apparently. And the blue glowy ball is the real X's magic ghost. These two plot twists are separated by one boss, and like so much of the story, it all just kinda happens. CL making Copy X puts her actions in a new light. She's no longer acting out of altruism or empathy, she's acting out of guilt. And because she's responsible for all the horrible things that Copy X has done. If the player really cared about CL and related to her as a person, it would have made the reveal a pretty painful one. Having X as the villain is a brilliant storytelling decision. On a first-time playthrough, it would be a major surprise for longtime fans. And revealing that he's a copy built in the absence of the original could have been a satisfying answer to why someone who looks like X was the villain, but we never see him or interact with him until the final boss. We could have had a scene where X was out committing war crimes with the kids, and Zero could be like, "Yo, X," and X could be like, "It's a maverick, kill it," and that would force Zero to work with the Resistance. What's worse is that when we fight him, he just flat out admits that he's a clone, which dissolves any tension that Zero's best friend could have become an evil tyrant. It would have been way more interesting to see him try and convince us that he is the original. He could have even mentioned events from the previous series. There's about as much evidence that Zero is a copy as there is against Copy X, and the fact that he doesn't try and turn the tables on him is pretty disappointing. You have the audacity to accuse me of being a copy when you don't even remember Dynamo? Trying to convince Zero that he's the fake hedgehog around here would have played into that theme of imposter syndrome I proposed earlier, and after Copy X is defeated, he can say, "Yeah, I am a copy, but what makes you think you're the original?" And leave the story on a note of ambiguity. Zero's originality is a topic that gets brought up later down the line, so this could have been some cool foreshadowing. It is easy for me to recommend setup for a story that I know the ending to, and it's possible that the path the story would go in wasn't decided, so take everything I say with a dash of salt. The biggest problem with Zero's story is that everything just kinda happens. It's just flaccid. There aren't any big moments to remember. Which is a shame because when I heard the contents of Zero's plot, I got pretty excited, but the actual presentation and execution is about as exciting as just reading it on a wiki. While I think my complaints are valid, I don't want to pin all the blame on Inti Creates. When critiquing the story, it's important to know the context surrounding this game, so if you didn't know, Mega Man X5 was intended to be the last game in the X series, and tried to be a definitive ending. Rumor has it that Mega Man Zero was actually going to continue off with the bad ending, where Zero becomes a maverick and X has to kill him, and then loses all of his memories. But, as we all know, Mega Man X5 would not be the last game in the X series. Mega Man X 6 out of 10 would come out in 2001 while Zero was still in development. meaning that the developers had to rewrite the story to not contradict existing canon. And because a lot of the game was finished, they needed to find a new reason for why X was the villain, which is what led to the creation of Copy X. Capcom really screwed over the developers of Zero so they could make a quick buck producing some of the series' worst games. While I like X's role in the Zero series as it is, this kind of weary guiding light who comes to Zero's aid when he can, I can't help but wonder if whatever the original story was might have been more compelling. It's not impossible that the story is exactly the same and all they changed was dialogue, but since this is the version we got, it's impossible to say. So, based on my arguments, you probably think I don't like this game, but I think there's a lot to enjoy in it. It's by no means my favorite Mega Man game, or even my favorite game in the series, but that doesn't mean I don't like it. It has a pretty solid boss roster, the 2-weapon system was a great inclusion that would persist throughout the rest of the series. Mega Man Zero 1 is what I'd consider a 6 out of 10. No, not like that one. A game with strange and frustrating design decisions that pulled down what is ultimately still a fun game. I don't think it's bad, I think it's strange more than anything. I'm definitely going easier on the game because I know the story actually goes somewhere, and if it was the only game in the series, I'd be way harsher on it and its almost non-existent story. So I do recommend Mega Man Zero 1. Not as an all-time classic, but as a strange and ambitious little game from a developer who haven't quite found their footing yet. It'd be much harder for me to recommend this game without the knowledge that things do get better.